So it's Halloween. Happy Halloween to everyone today. So I guess it's appropriate we're telling some stories. As she mentioned, I'm from Six Nations. That's the Six Nations Indian Reserve within southern Ontario, Canada. For those of you who have good geographic knowledge, you know exactly where that is. If not, if you know where Toronto is, we're about an hour and 15-minute drive west of Toronto, and only about an hour and 15 minutes also west of Niagara Falls. So that's where my reserve is located. I grew up in western New York, actually, New York State, between Buffalo and Niagara Falls, New York. But my dad was from the Six Nations Reserve, and when I was a kid, this age, we used to go and visit quite frequently to relatives back there. Without giving away my age, I can tell you that things were quite different on the reserve at that time than where I grew up in western New York. When we would go back and visit my great-grandmother, who still had the homestead there, the reserve had no paved roads, none at all. It was always dusty, so whenever you're driving down the road, there was always a big trail of dust behind the cars, so you could see cars coming from a long distance because you saw the dust before anything else. There was actually no electricity on reserve at that time either, and no running water. So imagine what that's like. It wasn't that long ago, and yet those were the conditions at Six Nations. It was also a rural community, so at that time houses were like a quarter of a mile apart. So space has an interesting way of kind of creating different environmental conditions and how things actually feel. So here, where you're in a city, there's always people around. You always feel like there's a presence of other human activity and energies. But out there, you could be just by yourself or just with your family all day long. But it was a very interesting experience for me growing up, and I remember staying there and going to visit with no electricity. We'd get up sometimes in the middle of the night and you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And I remember actually doing that as a kid, opening my eyes in the bedroom and going like this, and I could not actually see my hand. There was no street lights to kind of send light in, and if it was a cloudy day or a dark day, it was very, very dark out there. So that's the kind of experience that you have, kind of houses every so often, not very close together. Sometimes a great feeling of isolation right there when you're at your place, and very dark and lonely and dusty. And that's kind of my memories of the Six Nations Reserve when I was a kid. Now, my dad, when I was young, told me some stories about his experience and some stories that he was told by his grandfather, who would be my great-grandfather. And my dad actually grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, which is a city, for part of his life. And then his mother brought him to his grandparents to raise him on the Six Nations Indian Reserve. And so he spent most of his youthful years at Six Nations, where his parents really were his grandparents, his grandmother and his grandfather. And so that kind of became his reality as he was growing up. And so he told me some stories that have always stayed with me. They're not the kind of stories that you get in the movies today where all kinds of crazy things happen and all sorts of like special effects in movies and monsters and all of that. They were just very subtle kinds of stories that still, when I was a kid, when I was your size, scared the heck out of me. But that was me. So I don't know how, times have changed. Your kids have seen a lot more things these days on television. So I'm not sure how it actually will go. But let me tell you the stories then. There's 3 stories that I want to tell. 2 are very similar, and then one's a bit different. But they all took place right there on my family homestead on the Six Nations Reserve. And what my dad told me is that one time his grandfather, and this was a rural community, so they had a farm, and they had a barn, and they had a well for water. They had to pump their own water and whatnot. So they raised a lot of their own food and then traded for other types of foods that they didn't raise. But they had cows and they had horses and things like this. They didn't even have a car back then, so they had horse and buggy actually back when my dad was growing up. So his grandfather was in the barn one time and he was milking a cow, right? And remember, things are pretty, you're in the barn by yourself, your animals, there's not a lot of other people around. So you're kind of just in your own space, in your own environment. But as he was milking the cow, suddenly that cow started to get agitated, started to do some funny things, started to move around a lot like cows don't normally do when they're getting milked. And he thought it was odd because this animal was doing this strange behavior that he hadn't seen before. So he kept at it though, he kept working at it, and then he felt like suddenly he wasn't alone anymore, that somebody was there or something was there, because the cow really started to get agitated and started to almost hop and jump around a little bit. He tried to get the cow to settle down, like settle down, but it wouldn't settle down. So after a while he's still milking the cow, and then he looks over his shoulder and there's this old woman just standing there looking at him. Now he didn't know what to do. So he kept milking the cow, and then he started talking to her. But the cow was still agitated. It's still moving around. It's jumping. It's wrestling. So he starts talking to the old woman. Oh, I didn't see you there. Where'd you come from? Pleasure to have you here. He's still milking the cow, and the cow's jumping around. And he doesn't hear any response. Nothing comes back. But the cow is still moving around. So he looks back. The old woman's still there, just looking at him, not saying anything. So he keeps milking the cow, and he thinks this is very strange. Maybe she's old. Maybe she's hard of hearing. She can't hear very well. Keeps milking the cow, and all of a sudden the cow settles down. It stops moving around. It stops being jittery. And he looks over his shoulder, and what do you think? What do you think happened? She wasn't there anymore, right? After the cow settled down, it was because the old woman was no longer there. So that's one of the stories he told me. Another he said, and this is sort of similar, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. But again, like I said, there were no cars back when he was a kid. This is when my dad was a kid, and his grandfather and grandmother were running this farm on the Six Nations Indian Reserve. So a little while later, maybe it's a couple months later, my grandfather jumped into the horse and buggy. He had to go horse and buggy all over the place down those dirt roads. And he was driving down what we call Fourth Line Road. My family's property is on a road called Fourth Line. And so he had to go into town to buy some materials or get some supplies. He's in the horse and buggy, and so it's a pretty nice day out actually, going down the road in the horse and buggy, and all of a sudden that horse gets jittery, and it starts picking up speed. And he's trying to settle that horse down, trying to tug on the reins and calm the horse down, and the horse wouldn't calm down. So the horse just starts taking off. And so he's doing the best he can to kind of navigate that horse to go in the right way and settle the horse down. And what do you think was going on? He felt the presence again of something very close to him, right? So he's in this buggy, the buggy for supplies, and he's trying to get this horse to calm down, and it's just, neighing and wrestling his head back and forth like this, running and bouncing down the road as he's trying to calm it down. He looks over his shoulder. What do you think he sees? The old lady? Yeah, it was the old lady again. And she's standing, but this time she has a cane, right? So she's got this cane, she's got her head, she's sitting in the back bench of the buggy, and she's just looking at him like this. And just looking at him, that horse is going crazy, running around. So he tries to talk to her again. He doesn't know how she got in the buggy. He started to think, how did she get in the buggy? I was going down. So he tries talking to her again. No, I didn't see you there. You need a ride into town? I'll be happy to take you into town. And you can come up front if you want and sit with me, and we'll talk and we'll enjoy the ride to town. The horses are still going crazy, and they start galloping even faster and faster, and he's trying to talk to the old lady in the back. And then all of a sudden the horse calms down to a steady gallop. just calms down, and it's just a nice pace down Fourth Line Road. Of course, there's a little bit of dust, right, from the gravel of the road. So he looks over his shoulder. What do you think happened? She was gone, right? She was gone. That's right, totally gone. He couldn't explain it. Where did this old woman come from? What was that all about? Who was she? Was she an old relative who had come back to see him, who wanted to talk to him, who wanted to warn him, or whatever? He didn't know. He never knew. But what's the one element that combines those two stories? What's common?
The old lady.
The old lady's common? What else? What else was in the stories? Animals? And what did the animals do? Yeah, they reacted, right? Even before he knew something was there, the animals reacted to the presence of this woman or whatever she was. They reacted. And sometimes in nature, that's the case, that human beings actually have learned from animal behaviors. Sometimes seeing what an animal will eat informed human beings what possibly they could eat. Can't be always the case, but it was sometimes observing animal behavior helps humans understand what they should do and what they can do. So it's an interesting kind of subtle story, these two stories that my father told me. So now we're going to move forward in time, okay? That was when my dad was a kid living on the Six Nations Reserve. He, for a while, then went back to Hamilton, Ontario, where his mother came back from working abroad. And so he spent some of his teenage years in Hamilton, Ontario, working in different factories there, steel factories where they manufactured steel. And also made some friends there. One of his friends was this big guy by the name of Stan, really big guy. He was a football player. And they used to kind of play in the junkyard in Hamilton and do all this stuff together when they were younger. But then my dad eventually joined the Army and ended up serving in the armed forces for a period of about 4 years. And whenever he could, on leave or whatever, he would come back to the Six Nations Reserve, come back to Hamilton, and visit his family. So one time he came back to visit his grandmother at the same place where all these other stories and weird things happened, right? So he comes back and he's got his army uniform on and everything. They're very proud of him for having served in the army and so forth. And at this time he had enough money to buy a car, so he bought a car and drove down Fourth Line Road to his grandmother's place, right? Lots of dust, following the car all the way down Fourth Line. And back then, well, the way the roads still are is when you enter the Six Nations Reserve on Fourth Line Road, the first road you come to is Cayuga Road, which is an Indian Nation name. Then you get to Onondaga Road, which is an Indian Nation name. Then you get to Tuscarora Road, which is another name of an Indian nation. And then you get to the homestead, the old family homestead. And Six Nations actually is called Six Nations because it's based on the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. So Cayuga is one, Onondaga is one, Tuscarora is one. Then you also have Seneca, Oneida, and Mohawk nations. Those are the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. So my father came back to visit with his grandmother, and he had Stan with him, his friend from Hamilton. So they went to, stayed there during the day, and at night they figured they were going to drive into Hamilton and have lots of fun and do some partying late at night. And my grandmother, who by that time was about 75, 80 years old, said, "I don't think you should do that. I don't think you should go. I don't think it's wise to do that. I don't want you to get into trouble. So I think you guys are going to get yourselves into trouble, and I don't want you to do that." But they decide, "Oh, Grandma, you're superstitious. You're just being overly cautious. So we're going to go and have a good time in Hamilton." And they were young, and they actually wanted to go see girls. They wanted to see if they could find some girls to have some fun with and so forth. So they went to Hamilton. Day turns to night, and now they're driving back very late at night coming off onto the reserve on 4th Line Road, right? And so they're driving down 4th Line Road, and it's very dark out. Of course, again, it's all gravel road, lots of dust. And they don't even get to Cayuga Road yet. They don't even get to Cayuga. And Stan looks out the right window, and he sees this light just off in the fields. And at first he thought, oh, it just must be some house way back in the woods and so forth. And they keep driving. It's a long, 4th Line Road is a long road. It takes a long time to drive down it. Dusty and rough. And so they keep driving, and Stan looks again, just about 30 seconds later. And what do you think he sees? Sees the light again. Now, is that light following them? He didn't know. He says, that looks like the same light I saw 30 seconds ago, right? And it kind of, it seems like it's a little bit closer this time. And it looks like one of those old lanterns. You ever see those old lanterns in the cartoons or like in the movies or something? You hold it like this, and it's just a candle or an oil lamp in there, and it's just burning, right? That's what it looks like. So they're driving down. So Stan says to my dad, now my dad's name was Harold Paul, but for some reason they called him Jack, and all of his aunts and uncles called him Jackie, right? So I don't know how that worked out, but he was called Jackie. So Stan says, Jackie, go a little bit faster. Just pick up some speed. So he picks up some speed, and they're driving down 4th Line Road, and all this dust is kicking up behind them. The stones are hitting the fenders of the car, and he says to my dad, says, Jackie, look out the window here. Do you see a light? And so my dad looks, and there's a light. He says, yeah, I see it. And Stan goes, well, that light's following us. He said, no, it can't be following us, right? So he decides to pick up more speed, and now they're driving down 4th Line Road. They pass Cayuga Road, and now they're heading towards Onondaga Road, and that light just stays with them all the way down. They look out into the fields, and they can kind of see it sometimes behind the tree and behind the bushes, as it's just kind of following them off in the distance there. But at the same time, sometimes it gets closer, they pick up speed, gets a little bit further back, and then it comes up faster again. So now they're getting really scared. These two guys, my dad from the military, Big Stan, the football player, but they're getting scared because they'd never seen anything like this before. So, and the cars back then were really big too. So they hit more gas, picking up speed, and they go flying past Cayuga Road, thinking, well, maybe it'll stop at Cayuga Road. No, it doesn't stop at Cayuga, right? They're going faster and faster. They go past Onondaga Road, and now they're maybe going 60 miles an hour on a gravel road, which is not a good idea. Not a good idea, right? Because you can go into a spin, skid, go off the road. But that light stays with them, and now it seems like it's picking up speed and getting close to them. So now these two big guys are just flying down the road, past Tuscarora Road. They're getting closer to where the family homestead is, where the farm is. And the house that is still on our property, our family property, which was part of the old farm homestead, is way back on a dirt road as well. So it's way off in the distance once you turn off the road. But there was a gate that was right there at the driveway. So they come screeching up with this light following them, screech and pull into the driveway, skidding in there, but the gate's closed, right? So now what are they going to do? Then there's that light still coming up closer and closer up to them, And so my dad says, Stan, get out and open the gate. What do you think Stan did? He didn't move. He was too afraid. Big football guy, but he said, Jackie, I'm not getting out of the car. I don't know what that thing is. Never seen anything like that before. And that light's getting closer. I'm not getting out of the car. He says, you get out of the car. And my dad says, no, I don't think I'm going to get out of the car either, right? He was afraid too, right? So then my dad says, well, Stan, let's both of us get out and open the gate, right? And so they both start to get out of the car. And then they jump back in the car. And he said, well, no, we can't do that. What if that thing out there jumps in the car and takes the car away, right? So they didn't want to do that in case this thing, whatever it was, jumped into the car and drove the car away. So they looked at it, they thought about it, and so my dad just put the car in reverse a little bit, and they said, there's only one way to go here. And so they hit the gas, and they broke through the gate. So now they're driving up the laneway, right? And the laneway is a dirt laneway too, and there's all dust behind it, and that light's still coming, right? And now the house that we had there was an old farmhouse, kind of built on the reserve, and a lot of times those houses began as log cabins. They had sort of a barn roof on them. And over time, the family would put sort of siding around it, kind of finish it off so it didn't look like a log cabin, but it sort of looked like a little farmhouse with a barn roof on it. And it was 2-story. And as they're driving up the laneway, they see my grandmother, this old Indian woman, in the second floor window of the house, right? They can kind of see her silhouette in the window as they're driving up the driveway, right? And so they come screeching up to the house, open the doors right away, and run into the house, right? And so they do that, and they think, oh, thank goodness, they're finally home, and they're safe. And so my grandmother, who was upstairs, called down to my father, says, Jackie! Now, he was in trouble now, wasn't he? Jackie, what are you doing? Right? And he says, well, Grandma, we just got home, And she said, what's wrong? And they were afraid to say what had happened, right? But she had seen it. She was in the upper window of that second floor, and she saw the light, right? And she said, I know what happened. She said, I told you to not go out tonight, not get yourselves in trouble, to be home early, right? But you didn't listen to me. And that light is known as the witch light, the witch's light, right? And among a lot of different Native communities, you often hear stories of the witch's light that will follow you if you've been bad. Because why? Because it's sort of like a bad thing, and it wants to look for other bad things that are happening, right? And gain strength from that. So she saw the light and told him, don't you ever do that again. And I don't think those big guys ever did do that again, because they were too afraid to do that again, right? So that's the other story, the third story that I wanted to tell you. Now, oftentimes when Native people tell these kinds of stories to their kids, why do you think they tell them these kinds of stories?
So they stay behind.
They stay behaved, that's right. Or even stay close to home, right? Because if you're afraid a little bit about the darkness and about going too far away from home, you're more likely to stay close to your family, right? And that's a good thing. Because even in the old days, it was important that the family as a whole, or the community, or the tribe had to stay together so that they could protect themselves and to be safe. So oftentimes these kinds of sort of ghost stories, if you call them that, or scary stories, are really meant so that you understand that a little bit of fear is sometimes a good thing. Because if you think something isn't a good thing to do, it's probably not a good thing to do. It's actually good to be a little bit afraid of things sometimes. Okay? And so those are 3 stories from the Six Nations Reserve that my dad told me. Okay? Any questions?
Did anybody else see the old lady?
No, not as my dad told me, just my grandfather. So, who knows? Don't know. Who she was, where she came from, or what she was doing there.
Did you behave when you were a kid after you heard this?
Oh, yeah. It's funny because, again, when I think back of, spending time at Six Nations, that environment sort of keeps you close, again, because it's kind of different, right? Like in a rural area even, you can feel alone pretty quickly, even though there's lots of space around. It's a weird kind of thing. So we were absolutely in the house at night when it got dark out. And of course, there was no plumbing, so you had to go to the outhouse in the middle of the night. That was a scary thing, Just to have to get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom outside was a scary thing. Right? That would be real scary. So,
different cultures have similar type situations or?
There's a lot of stories, I think, about witch lights, you know. There's also stories about knocks, that if you ever hear that on your door and nobody's there, don't open the door, you know, because then you're letting in something that you shouldn't let in. And across many different cultures, native cultures, you get those kinds of stories of witch lights and of knocking. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it.